Maranatha, my loved ones, and welcome to another presentation of our prophecy seminar, Unveiling Revelation. Your life is about to change forever. So today we're going to be covering part 2 of our previous presentation having to do with the image of the beast, right? Revelation reveals the image of the beast, part number 2. And so before we get started, let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for this opportunity. We thank you for this blessing. We thank you for your love and your patience. We thank you, Father, for the warnings that you give us in the book of Revelation throughout your Bible, so that, Father, so that we can be prepared, so that we can live lives according to your will, and we may also be aware of the deceptions that the enemy is going to be doing, especially in these end times, Father. And so we thank you for your word, for your guidance, and we just ask that you help us to continue to go deeper and understand your word in a personal way. And we thank you, Father, for this blessing, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. And so we had quite a very interesting presentation, our previous presentation, talking about the image of the beast, right? Remember, we've been studying, we've been going deeper into that last warning, God's last message in Revelation chapter 14, right? Revelation chapter 14, we find what is known as the everlasting gospel, the three angels' message. And so in this message, we are warned about worshiping the beast, about worshiping the image of the beast, about Babylon, and about the mark of the beast. And so we've been breaking this down. We've been covering a lot of this already. And we're going to continue to do so today, right? Because previous presentation, we talked specifically, it says in Revelation chapter 14, verse number 9, saying that anyone worships the beast and his image. And so we went through a very interesting study trying to find out what is the image of the beast. And so first we needed to identify the beast before we were able to identify the image of the beast. And we saw that the beast of Revelation, right, that kingdom, remember, beast is not an insult. It's just it's a symbol for a kingdom or a nation based on Daniel 7:25. And we saw that kingdom that we're warned about in Scripture, that beast power that is going to rise up, is none other than the Vatican City, right? That nation, that kingdom that rose up amongst the ruins of the Roman Empire. And so remember, we always want to remind you, we're not talking about Catholics. We're not talking about people that belong or that follow or that adhere to this specific belief system of Catholicism, right? Remember, there are many, many sincere, God-loving peoples in Catholicism. We're talking about the structure, the teachings, the practices, the doctrines, right? The institution itself and what it stands for, what it upholds and what it follows. And sadly, it's not following Scripture, right? It's following tradition. It's following the mixture of these pagan beliefs and practices from the past. And we'll be talking a little bit about that further on as we continue. So to find the image of the beast, we had to go then to Revelation chapter 13. And if you want to follow me and join me in Revelation chapter 13, Revelation chapter 13, we're going to go to verse number 10. It says, "He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity, and he who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword." Right? And we talked about that. That specific verse is talking about that 1798, when the papacy lost his political power. Right? Napoleon sent his general Berthier into Rome. Europe was tired. They had it up to here with the corruption of the papacy, right? With the corruption of the priesthood. And they said, no more. We're not going to continue to be puppets. We're not going to continue to give you this power. We're going to take it away. And so that's when he received his deadly wound in the year 1798. And then that's where verse 11 comes in, because it says, then or after what? Then or after 1798. Then or after the papacy was taken captive and then was taken into captivity and was received that mortal wound, right? The sword, the political power was taken away. He says, then I saw another beast, right? So here's again, there's two beasts in Revelation chapter 13. And so this second beast or this second kingdom rises up after the fall of the first beast, right? And it says this second beast had what? This second beast had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. So here it's giving us some characteristics pointing to things regarding to this beast. Is talking about speaking like it has horns like a lamb. We talked about those 2 horns, those 2 powers that are represented in this beast, the separation of church and state. It says horns like a lamb, making reference to there are Christian principles, Christian fundamentals in this nation, right? It is a nation that has these Christian Judeo foundations or principles, And then it says it spoke like a dragon, right? The dragon, in this sense, we know that the dragon represents the devil. So this nation, even though it represents in some way, it has certain characteristics of the Lamb, it also in some way, shape, or form is representing the dragon, right? Or will it speak like the dragon? Then it says, verse 12, he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. So the second beast, what we're seeing is going to heal the wound of the papacy. And if the wound we talked about was because he lost his political power, that means that the wound being healed implies that he is going to restore political power. And it is through the second beast or the second kingdom that this is going to happen. That the first beast, which is the Vatican, right, the papacy as the little king or the head of that system, is going to recuperate the civil political power that he once had during those 1,260 years. And we saw that what happened during that time period? Persecution. And so we're going to see that persecution is going to be restored through this second beast. It says he performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of man. I mentioned to you in the previous presentation that 13 and 14 we're going to be talking about in an upcoming presentation in regards to Revelation chapter 16, the Battle of Armageddon. So let's go to verse number 15. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So the second beast is doing what? He's restoring the power of the first beast because he's making an image to the first beast, right? And here's the concept of the image. The image comes through the second beast that is restoring the political power of the first beast. Verse 16, he causes all, right, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. So the second beast then is introducing, right, is presenting this system that is going to be carried out through the mark of the beast. And it says, and that no one may what? No one may buy or sell or except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Now, why is this important? Because it says in verse 15 that he was granted power to give breath to the image. Why? So that anyone who would not worship the image to the beast would be killed. Again, so we have a death decree. As it happened during the 1,260 years, as it happened during the time of the Inquisition and the Dark Ages, the church was in total political power in Europe and its colonies. And so anybody that would not submit to these powers, what would happen? They would receive a death decree. And so what it's saying here in Revelation is this is going to happen again, this time with the same power, that beast power, the Vatican. But now it's going to be a second beast that's going to give or introduce this power. And this is not going to be through the powers of Europe, at least not initially. And it continues to say in verse 18, and here's wisdom, let him who understands calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So my loved ones, this is the panorama that is presenting. After the fall of the first beast, after 1798, that first beast, the papacy, was going to fall, lose his political power in the year 1798. And that as a result, this second beast was going to come forth and was going to stand in its place, right? It was going to kind of, actually, as we talked about previously, the second beast rises up as a result of the fall of the first beast. The second beast is actually a result or the consequence of the abuses of the first beast. Now, to break that even deeper, we said we need to go a little bit before this to understand what was this beast, what was happening with the second beast before it became a second beast, because it talks about these three stages. What are the three stages of the second beast? First stage is when the beast, before it became a beast, or remember, the concept of beast implies a world superpower, as it was with Babylon, Medo-Persia, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire. These are world superpowers. So this beast is a world superpower, but before, right? It's already talking about here when it becomes that superpower. But the question is, what happened before it became that superpower? And for that, we went to Revelation chapter 12, right? Because those three stages, what are they? Before it was a superpower, when it becomes a superpower, which is the current stage that we find ourselves in right now, and then the last stage is going to be when this superpower does what? Restores the political power back to the first beast or to the papacy. And so for that, we had to go to Revelation chapter 12, right? Revelation chapter 12 gives us a fascinating prophetic panorama. Revelation chapter 12 is my favorite chapter in the book of Revelation. And we were reading off of verse number 13. And it says in Revelation chapter 12, verse 13, we're just giving a quick review, a quick run-by, so that we can once again throw out the framework for what we're going to be studying today, because we identified the second beast in the last presentation, but we did not mention what is or how is the image going to come forth, and that's what we're going to do today. So it says in Revelation chapter 12, verse 13, now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he did what? He persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. So what does the dragon do? The dragon persecutes, right? He persecuted the church. Why? Because the child had been born, as we talked about. He ascended into heaven. The devil could no longer carry out his wrath on the child, trying to avoid because of the prophecy of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 and 16, where it says that that child is the one that was going to destroy the devil. And so he's trying to avoid that situation happening. And so what happens is that once the child ascends, the devil can't deal with him anymore. He has defeated him. So what is he doing? He's carrying out his wrath on the church, right? And we said that this verse 13 is happening between the time frame of the year 31, the ascension of Christ, and the year 538. Where do we get that 538? Verse number 14. But the woman, as she was being persecuted, was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for how long? For times end, half a time from the presence of the serpent. So we talked about this. This is just a fascinating Bible verse, because it tells us that when the woman was being persecuted, God took her to the wilderness, right? He took her and he nourished her. He protected her for how long? For 1,260 years. That times and half a time period that we talked about in the previous presentation, from 538 to 1798. That's how I know verse 31 happens between the year 31 and 538, because verse 14 starts off with this time period of 538. Now, why? We talked about this yesterday, and this, I think, is just amazing. God did not give a special protection to his church in verse number 13, right? It says that the woman was being persecuted. And of course, it doesn't mean that God was not taking care of her. It doesn't mean that God was not watching over her. No, but there is a special protection in verse 14 in that time period where God has to nourish her from 538 to 1798. And we talked about this. And the reason is very simple, is because God put a special protection around his church in this time period, because if he had not done this, the plan of salvation, the gospel, would have been completely distorted and perverted through the power of the first beast, through the papacy, which was trying to distort, right? Trying to pervert and pollute the gospel in any way, shape, or form. It was a total distortion to the principles of heaven, to the principles of the Word of God. And so God had to put this special protection around his church, because if he would not have done that, the gospel would have been completely eliminated, right? It would have been unrecognizable. And so God does this special protection, seeing how the enemy changed his method. And he says, I'm not longer going to attack the church from the outside. I'm going to pervert her from within. And so God puts this special protection. But then what happens? It says in verse 15, so the serpent, because of the protection that God was putting around his church, spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. So again, we talked about waters, right? Waters, rivers, oceans. They represent people, tribes, tongues, nations. So what it's telling us in verse 15 is that the serpent, or the devil, is throwing everything he has at the church, right? In Europe, he did everything possible to destroy the church with as much as, because he knew, right? He was going to do as much harm as possible to God's people. He says, I can't deal with the child of the Messiah anymore, but I'm going to try to end his people. But then what happened? And here's where it gets even more interesting. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Notice God protected his church for how long? For 1,260 years, from 538 to 1798. And the devil did everything possible to destroy the church, to destroy the plan of salvation, to destroy the gospel from being presented to the world. But then something happened. God no longer, after verses 15 and 16, no longer needed to protect his church anymore in Europe. Why? Because she moved to the land, or to this place that was going to be the protection, right? This place that was going to now protect God. That's why he takes his protection, his special protection away, because now she's going to have a special protection in this land. That is done what? Is neutralize the power of the dragon, of the beast in Europe. And so, my loved ones, verse 17, and the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. We'll be talking about that later on, verse 17, because where are we right now? We're right now in verse number 16. But the earth helped the woman, right? And so here, my loved ones, is where it gets fascinating, because what place or what land or what territory protected the church from the abuses of church and state in Europe, right? The church was being under attack in Europe, first through the papacy and then also through the Church of England. And so another number of ways Christianity was being suppressed in one way or another. And what happened is the church did what? It said the church left and moved where? Oh, it moved to the United States of America. So this land, this beast, is the United States of America. I have my USA tie on today, right? Why? Because this is the principles of this nation. This nation, as we talked about, was founded on this separation of church and state, right? These Judeo-Christian principles of people that came, they fled Europe. And why? What did they do? They said, no. We're not going to follow in the mistakes of Europe. We see what happens when church and state are together, when there's no separation. And so this nation is founded on that principle of doing what? Of separating church and state, right? That is the principles of this nation because of the abuses that they saw that was happening in Europe. And that's exactly what happens in Revelation chapter 13, because it says in Revelation 13:10 that the first beast falls in 1798, and then this second beast, or this second world power, rises up. And what is that power, nation? There's no other nation, my loved ones, the United States of America, right? We walk through those principles, we walk through those characteristics, and remember the ones that we had been studying and reviewing, and we saw that among these characteristics is it's a Christian nation. It's a young nation. It's a nation that separates church and state. It's a nation that rises up at the same time that the papacy is basically falling. It's a nation that takes in the refugees, right? Takes in the religiously oppressed from Europe. It's a nation that follows in all of these ways. And so there is no other nation, my loved ones, in the United States of America that fulfills this prophecy perfectly, amen? A nation that was founded on the separation, right? Civil liberties, founded in a republican form of government, and religious liberty founded in Protestantism. Those are the pillars. Those are the foundations of this nation, right? And we went and we saw the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States. And the very first amendment that they placed in there was what? Freedom of religion. The state shall not impose a religion, nor shall it prohibit any form of religion. And so this nation, my loved ones, that we love so much and dear so much, as what? Is a pillar of this, right? It's a pillar of Bible prophecy in the sense of it's fulfilling the purpose of separating church and state. That's why God didn't have to protect the church anymore. Why? Because the church now found a place where she was no longer going to be enforced or oppressed, right? Now, there are some issues with the Puritans at the beginning, but I'm talking in general, right? In general, after the mistakes that were made at the beginning, we found that this Constitution then establishes and protects the liberties of God's people, and both for religion and for against. If anybody does not want to worship any God, they're completely free to do it, and we should respect that right? Because that's how we know that our rights are being protected. And so we want to make sure that we do not force anybody to follow religion, and that's what the purpose of this nation was. Why? Because in Europe, what was happening? Religion was being imposed. Religion was being forced. And so this nation rises up as a counterfeit, right, to what was that oppression and that joining of church and state that was happening over in Europe. And so I say, praise the Lord for this. But we have a problem. And what is the problem? It says very clearly here that our nation that has horns like a lamb was going to speak like a dragon. Now, have we been speaking like a dragon? Yes. But in this context specifically, it would be implying going against those principles, right? Speaking like a dragon would be going against the principles of the Lamb, against the principles that are upheld in this context. And so that's why it says in verse 12 of chapter 13, and he exercises all authority of the beast first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell. So it's telling us that in some way, shape, or form, this great nation was going to deviate from those principles and was going to do what? Was going to then partner up with the papacy. Now, I want you to notice something in Revelation chapter 12, verse 17. It says in verse 16 that the earth helped the woman, right? But then it says in verse 17, and the dragon was enraged with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. In other words, this land, this territory, which is known now as the United States, was going to protect the church at first. But in verse 17, there is a change, and that's why the move from Christ, horns are like a lamb, to speaking like a dragon. It was going to go against those principles. In other words, if this nation was founded on that principle of separation in church and state, biblical principle, remember we saw, then that means that if it's going to go against those principles, if it's going to go against and attack the church, that means that at some point in the future, our nation is going to do what? Is going to take away the separation of church and state, and those two are going to come together. And we're going to see that that is the image of the beast, right? And some people are surprised. They're like, whoa, how is this going to happen? How is the United States, right, founded on separation of church and state, constitution, on all of these principles that are so loved and so upheld? Well, my loved ones, that's what prophecy teaches. Now, can we confirm this? Oh, yes, we can confirm this, my loved ones. I want to show you this image of how the change in our country began. How is it that our country, which began on these principles, we are going to see is going to move away? We already have abundant evidence proving and showing this. I want to show you this image on the screen, and this is from Time magazine. And if you can read it there, it says how Reagan and the Pope conspired to assist Poland's solidarity movement and hasten the demise of communism. Notice it's called the Holy Alliance. My loved ones, this is when our country, which at first was antagonistic against the papacy because of the abuses that she was doing out, now what we're seeing is, my loved ones, since Ronald Reagan, President Ronald Reagan, this is when they began to come together. This is when they start to find common ground, and it was in a battle against communism. Now, I'm not saying that communism is good in any way, shape, or form or bad. I'm being apolitical here. I'm just giving you facts in regards to the things that were happening. They saw we have a common enemy, and so you know the phrase, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so these two powers come together to do what? They come together and they say, we have a common enemy. Let's join together. Let's work together. And that's when the papacy and the United States, the presidency, began this relationship, my loved ones. And we are going to see that it has been strengthening far, far more than that. Look at what it says here in this book. The Keys of This Blood. This book is by Malachi Martin. Now, it says here, read it very clearly. It says Pope John Paul II versus Russia and the West, for control of what? For control of the New World Order. Now, who is Malachi Martin? He is a Jesuit priest. He was an intimate friend of John Paul II. And in his book, The Keys of This Blood, he is saying that there is a war or a battle being carried out between who? Between the Pope, right? The papacy. You have the West for what? For control of the New World Order and Russia. Now, if we go into page number 15, right, it says something fascinating in page number 15. It says that there was a three-way competition to establish the first one world government in the history of mankind. And it says that who were these three competing for? It was capitalism through the United States, it was Catholicism through the papacy, and it was communism through who? Through the Soviet Union. And guess what happened, my loved ones? Those three looked at each other and they were battling to establish this world government. This is based on what Malachi Martin is saying, right? Historian, scholar, Jesuit, intimate friend with John Paul II. And he says that what? Capitalism, United States, and Catholicism, the papacy, what did they do? They came together, and what did they do? They eliminated the Soviet Union. You can apply the concept of beast to the Soviet Union because the concept of beast means a superpower. The Soviet Union was the other superpower of that time. But what happened is that the United States and the papacy came together, and guess what? They eliminated the other superpower. So What do you think that made that relation? They're like, whoa, we're very powerful together. Maybe we should keep this up. Why should we put this aside? We are so powerful together that we have knocked off this power that we see in it. In that same book, I'm going to give you an interesting quote. In Keys of This Blood, Malachi Martin says that John Paul's, or the papacy's goal, is a geopolitical structure for the society of nations. That should cause great concern right here, because this intimate friend of John Paul II knew that what the papacy was pushing towards was what? Was a geopolitical structure for the society of nations. That means, my loved ones, that's a one world government, right? That's what they were pushing for. That's what they want. And we're going to see how this develops, especially when we go into Revelation chapter 17, which is going to be our next study as we follow this cycle, this pattern, or this cycle. And so when you look at the history of the presidency, my loved ones, you see that started with Ronald Reagan. Really started a little bit before with John F. Kennedy. But even John F. Kennedy, when you read his speech that he was given, because during the times of John F. Kennedy, when he was running for president, a lot of people were kind of afraid and saying, will he be a puppet to the papacy because he was Catholic, right? But even John F. Kennedy upheld the separation of church and state. He even said himself, he says, listen, I am not a puppet of the papacy. I am not here as a representative of the Catholic Church. I am here as a representative of the Democratic Party. I am running for the nominee of the president from this party, not as a Catholic. He says that's a total separate entity, my religious life from my political life. Now, you might agree or disagree, but he is trying to uphold at least the principles of separation of church and state. But he did visit the papacy. He did visit Rome. He did start the dialogue with them, right? And so Ronald Reagan comes along, and this is when it really consolidates. Then you have George Bush the first, right? He continues in the same way. Then you had, after George Bush, you had Clinton. And what we see is this pattern is continually of growing together, of strengthening this relationship. As again, what we talked about, they're too strong together. It's impossible to just put aside that power that they just had and say, oh, no, let's just forget about that. Let's go back to our old ways. No. Let's continue to collaborate. Let's continue to work together. Let's continue to build on this relationship as powerful and imposing as we can, because we just knocked down another superpower. And then after that, you have then George Bush the Jr., right? Now, look at what George Bush Jr. said. I thought this really blew my mind. This appeared in CatholicNet.com. This was March 22nd, 2001. Look at what George Bush said about John Paul II. He said, the best way to honor Pope John Paul II, truly one of the great men, is to take his teachings seriously, to listen to his words and put his words into action here in America. This is a challenge we accept. Oh, Lord, if the founding fathers of this nation, if the founders of the Protestant Reformation would be alive today and they would see what he said, they would be blown away. Because a president of the United States saying that the words of a pope should be put into action here in the United States. I mean, this is the purpose of this nation, the purpose of the Protestant Reformation was to do exactly the contrary to the words and the actions of the papacy, my loved ones. But we're seeing how this sentiment has changed and how the United States is now, instead of moving against the papacy, is starting to move in her direction, right? It's starting to come together again. And I'm going to continue to show you evidence how this is building and building and building. So after George Bush II, we had Obama. Same thing, right? Pope John Paul II died. Then came Benedict. And what you see is Obama and Benedict. Then you see after Obama comes Trump. Benedict was, he left, he resigned, he was resigned. Then Francis comes along, and now Francis comes along with Obama. And then you see, now you have Francis and Trump in this very moment, right? And you see the relation, even though those two don't really like each other, they don't really get along. They've been bitter at each other. But at the same time, they have to continue the diplomatic ties. Why? Because their political power is too strong. So it really doesn't matter who is the Pope, and it really doesn't matter who is the president. The powers of these two offices combined are such an imposing figure on the world that they said, no, we're not going to put that aside. So a lot of people will say, oh, okay, maybe the presidency is compromised, but we have a separation of church and we have a separation of powers, right? We have three powers: executive, legislative, and judicial. And the founders did this for a reason, so that not one form of government, not one of them, can dominate the others, right? And so, okay, that's very interesting. But then when you let's look at Congress, right? If you look at Congress, the majority of the leaders in Congress, guess what? Are Catholic, right? And so we just saw a few years ago where the papacy, Francis, came and gave a speech at the United States Congress, a joint speech. This has never happened before in the world, where the leader of a church can speak in front of all of Congress. Now, of course, he's not only the leader of the church. Remember, we talked a little bit about this in a previous presentation. He is also the king, right? He is the political head of the Vatican City, which is an independent, sovereign nation. Now, I want you to share with you something fascinating, because we have executive branch seems to be compromised. Legislative branch, the Senate, seems to be compromised. But what about the judicial? Some people say, oh, no. The judicial, they are the ones that would put a limit to this. If anybody tried to join these powers of church and state and they tried to impose this in our nation, definitely the judicial branch will not stand up for it. Well, I want to share you a quote here from Antonin Scalia. He was a Supreme Court justice before. And look at what he said in his writings. This is on a symposium of the role of government in monitoring and regulating religion in public life. This was in 1992. Look at what he told. Look at what he was told as recorded in Time magazine. He says, in the future, the rulings of the United States Supreme Court will be decided on the basis of majority benefit and traditional values instead of individual rights of conscience. Now, I don't know if you caught what he's saying there, my loved ones, but it's saying something very clear. He's saying what? He's speaking exactly against the Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights was made with what purpose? That the government cannot impose itself on you, and that the majority cannot impose their beliefs. And he's saying that in the future, the basis of majority benefit and traditional values instead of individual rights of conscience. That's how the decisions are going to be made. He's speaking directly against what? Against the Bill of Rights. If you notice also, William Rehnquist, right? He used to be the head of the Supreme Court. Now it's John Roberts. Look at what he said. He said, the wall of separation between church and state is a metaphor based on bad history. It should be frankly and explicitly abandoned. My loved ones, this is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court saying what? That the separation of church and state should be abandoned. It's weak. And I don't know about you, but this should be a cause of alarm for us, my loved ones. Now, it's interesting because when you look at the composition of the Supreme Court, especially nowadays, it's interesting because of the 9 judges, you have what? You have 6 judges that lean Catholic. They're considered Catholic. It's just amazing, my loved ones. That means that the majority of those in the Supreme Court are Catholic. So why do I say this? That means that if in some way, shape, or form, the executive branch or the legislative branch tried to pass laws, right? Tried to impose these laws, as what happened during the 1,260 years, that means that the Supreme Court would be in charge, or they would be the protectors of the Constitution, and yet the majority of them are already inclined or lean this way. Now, I'm not saying that immediately means that they're going to rule in favor of such laws if this were to happen, we're going to see that it is. That is actually what the mark of the beast is. But what we're saying is that there's a high probability that everybody's fallen in line already, right? And so it should not surprise us, and especially after reading these quotes that we just looked at. Now, look at what Pope John Paul II said in 1991 during his tour of Poland in 1798. John Paul II denounced, what did he denounce? Excessive materialism and separation of church and state. Look at this quote, my loved ones. This is amazing. It's saying right here that the Pope is doing what? He's denouncing excessive materialism. That should not surprise us. But also what? Separation of church and state. Now, why do you think that the papacy is denouncing the separation of church and state. Very simple. Because when the church and state are separated, they do not have power. They do not have the political power that they would like to have as they had during the 1,260 years. And so it's telling us very clearly here that that's what they want. They don't want church and state to be separated. They want to join it. And so that's the tendency that we're starting to see. As we're seeing in our nation, what are we seeing? We're seeing in our nation when these political powers are getting very comfortable with the religious powers in our nation, right? We're seeing where the church is starting to use the power of the state to try to impose, to try to coerce, right? They're trying to force it, of course. Because we have the separation of powers, because we have these constitutional guarantees, they have not been able to do it. But they are pushing the envelope, and it's going to be very soon where we're going to see that they're going to be able to push the envelope of the line, and they're going to cross it completely. Because that's what prophecy says. Our nation is going to do what? Our nation is going to, was upholding these principles, our nation is going to go against these principles. Look at what Pope John Paul II, I'm sorry, not John Paul II. Look at what Francis said recently. This was in 2015, January, speaking to the Chicago Tribune. This is through Associated Press. Look at what he says. This is Pope Francis. He was on the papal plane, and he was talking about limits to freedom of expression. And look at what he says as he's talking about Albert Gaspari. Gaspari is one of his, he organizes papal trips. He's like an assistant. Look at what Francis said. If my good friend Dr. Gaspari says a curse word against my mother, he can expect a punch, Francis said, throwing a pretend punch in his way. So he's kind of playing around with Dr. Gaspari. Look at what he says. He says it's normal. You cannot provoke. You cannot insult the faith of others. You cannot make fun of the faith of others. So basically what he's saying is, if you insult my religion, I have the right to beat you, to hit you, to punch you, to use violence against you, right? That doesn't sound very Christ-like, because Christ says that when they slap you, to put the other cheek. But anyway, let's continue. Look at what he continues to say. There are so many people who speak badly about religions or other religions, who make fun of them, who make a game out of the religions of others. He said, they are provocateurs. Now, could it be understood that what I'm doing here is a provocation? Yes, right? And what happens to them is what would happen to Dr. Gaspari if he says a curse word against my mother. There is a limit, says Francis. In other words, there is a limit to freedom of speech. He's very clearly saying, if somebody provokes, if somebody makes fun of, if somebody speaks against a religion, they can expect that what? They can expect that there will be violence used against them. That's exactly what he's saying. And what we're doing here could be considered in some way, shape, or form a provocation. Now, again, I'm not trying to be provocative, right? We're just trying to look at Bible prophecy and study it and understand it as it's here. And sadly, this is where it points to. This is what it's showing to in this context. And so we should be, my loved ones, alarmed at this, because these are the things that, remember, we had a president say, oh, yes, what they say should be used, right? We should follow their actions here in the United States. And my loved ones, this is what we're looking at. And that's why the prophecy says he looks like a dragon, but he does what? I mean, he has horns like a lamb, but he speaks like a dragon, right? And so our nation is going to move away from these Judeo-Christian principles, away from what we see. And so let's go back to Revelation chapter 13. I want to just walk through, in these last minutes we have, walk through what Revelation chapter 13 is actually saying and how this is going to come forth. Watch this. Revelation chapter 13, verse 11, we already talked about that. It says he comes out of the earth, right? Out of the place where there's not lots of people, tribes, nations, tongues. That's exactly what the United States represents. Coming up, Anabaino grew up, right? It did not conquer another beast. It says in the same thing, had two horns like a lamb, two horns, there's two powers, separation of church and state. Lamb, a young sheep, a young nation with Christian-like principles. But he spoke like a dragon. Our nation, my loved ones, I would say ever since not only the joining of the papacy with Ronald Reagan, but I would say September 11th, you have all of these events that are happening that are moving our nation away from the foundation of the principles that we once upheld so dearly. It says here, in verse 12, he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. In other words, our nation is going to do what? Our nation is going to enforce what? Enforce a system of worship that is following in the line of the Vatican, right? It's going to move in out of the political realm, and it's going to impose the religious realm, which is interesting because that's exactly what our nation was founded on, not doing, right? Not doing those things. Then we said 13 and 14. We're going to be talking about that later, further on. But let's read it anyway, because it says he performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. 14, he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the beast, now this is important, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast. That concept of telling those who dwell on the earth is the concept of persuasion. This talks about democratic principles, right? It's not forcing at the beginning, it's persuading. It's telling them, maybe we should make an image to the beast, right? Maybe we should lift up, maybe we should follow in the ways of the past in that sense. And so this is not happening by force, at least not at the beginning. At the beginning, it is persuasion. It is the people that are asking, right? Because this nation moves based on what the people decide. And so it is the very own people of the United States that are going to ask our nation to move in that direction. Now, when you look at the electorate in our nation, you have that about 70 to 75% of people in this nation consider themselves to be Christians. 70 to 75%. Right? Very strong evangelical political movement in our nation. You have Catholicism. So right now, they're not able to impose it because they're fractured, right? They're not voting on the same issues. They're not following the same agenda. But what will happen if these two powers come together in our nation? You're talking about 70 to 75%. And they decide that based on common principles, based on common beliefs, they decide that what? Oh, maybe we should start to impose some Christian laws because morality is just getting out of control. Things are just bad. So maybe we need to what? Maybe we need to start imposing Christian standards, Christian principles on people legislatively. And so what would the politicians, what would the congressmen do? What would the elected officials of our nation do? You think they're going to say, oh, no, that's unconstitutional? No, my loved ones, we're seeing very clearly that they're just going to follow in what their constituents say. Whether it's constitutional or not, they don't care. Their main priority, at least not all of them, but the majority of them, their main priority is to stay in power. And so if that's what they need to do to stay in power, because that's what their constituents are asking for, that's exactly what they're going to follow in. Verse number 15, and he was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Now, once again, what is the image of the beast? An image is a reflection, right? A likeness to something. So, if in this country we're going to lift an image to the beast, that means that it has to be a reflection, a likeness to the beast. Now, what is the main issue or the main problem with the beast? Is that the beast does not separate church and state. That first beast power, talking about the Vatican. They don't separate it, but they join, right? They want both powers. They want to use it. I've shown you a number of quotes. And so when our nation, it says that we're going to make an image to the beast and that our own citizens are going to ask, it means, my loved ones, is that we're going to do what? We're going to want to impose religious laws, and we're going to say what? Oh, forget about the separation of church and state. It's not that important. More important is following Christian principles. And now, don't get me wrong. I believe that we should live by these Christian principles, but I do not believe that they should be enforced on anybody, because Christ never forced anybody to follow him. And so that's the problem. We should not be using the power of the state, the power of the civil sword, to impose our beliefs on others. That's not what Christianity is about. It's through our influence. It's through our testimony. It's through our witness that we should be winning people over for the kingdom of God, not trying to force them to do what we believe we should, what we know is right. That's not the Christian way, my loved ones. Christianity is about choice in the sense of God doesn't force anybody. He says, you choose what path you want to take, right? God is love, and the essence of love is liberty and freedom. So when we start imposing our beliefs on others, my loved ones, we're going down a very slippery path. And that's the image of the beast, my loved ones. That's what we're going to do. We are going to what? We are going to take away the separation of church and state, and that is the image of the reflection that we're going to be making of the papacy. But it doesn't finish there. Because it says in verse 16, he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to do what? To receive what? To receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads. So my loved ones, if you notice this, the imposing of this, right, to cause all the earth to worship the beast, to impose this, you have to be a mighty political power, right? And that, of course, is the United States is no bigger political power military power in the world, right? Not only political, yes, it's political, but military. Our military, my loved ones, is the most powerful military in the world, and it's not even close. That's why I find it amusing when people say, oh, the United States, we've lost ground military. Like, really? If you look at the military sheet, right? When you look at the budget, the military budget for the United States, our military budget is alone bigger than the next 10 militaries in the world. I'm going to say that again. Our military budget is bigger than the next following 10 militaries in the world. Our military budget, just to put it this way, is double number 2. And number 2 is China. And our military budget is the double of China. So when somebody implies that we're in some way, shape, or form losing our military power, I don't know what they're talking about, because we are completely, there has never been a military world power like the United States of America. We dominate. So when we see that it's forcing and it's imposing, right? It's using its political power, its military power to impose these things. This should not surprise us, my loved ones. This should not in any way surprise us. And sadly, we're going to move in that realm, and we're going to give the papacy its position. Now, I want to read here on chapter number 13, something that is really amazing. I'm going to share with you something that is really amazing. And look at what it says. And that no one, verse 17, may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. What is it saying here? That no one may buy or sell except the one that has the mark or the name of the beast. We're going to see the mark of the beast further on. But here's where it caught my attention. No one may buy or sell. What is buying or selling? Buying or selling is the free market, right? The ability to buy or sell means the ability to do economic transactions, right? To buy a house, to buy a car, to buy food, to have a business, buying and selling of goods. What it's saying, in other words, is that in some way, shape, or form, we're going to be the head of this movement, and we are going to use the buying and selling, the market, to control people and to try to persuade them, to try to coerce them, to try to force them to accept the worship in regards to the mark of the beast of the Vatican, or this false system of worship that the Vatican wants to impose. It's saying here that our nation is going to do what? Is going to use the free market system. Now, we are the biggest economic power in the world again, right? Again, remember, a beast dominates militarily, culturally, politically, economically, technologically, on so many fronts. So it says here that we in some way, shape, or form are going to use that. Now, this is amazing. And this should blow your mind, the global economic power we have. I'm going to show you on the screen this quote. And this quote is from 2015. This is from the Vatican City news site. And the title is, "The Holy See and the United States Sign a Historic Agreement to Fight Offshore Tax Evasion." Pay attention to this as you read this. This agreement, which is the first formal intergovernmental agreement between the Holy See and the United States, underscores the commitment of both parties to promote and ensure ethical behavior in the financial and economical fields. What? Yes, it says very clearly here, this is from the Vatican City, that the Vatican City and the United States are doing what? Are committed to promote and ensure ethical behavior in the financial and economic fields. It says, in remarks delivered at the signing ceremony on Wednesday morning in the Vatican, Archbishop Paul Gallagher, Secretary for Relations with States of the Holy See, explained in more detail the significance of the intergovernmental agreement with the United States, addressing the United States ambassador to the Holy See. This is what he said. The signing of this agreement is unquestionably a historic event. This is, in fact, the first time that the Holy See and the United States of America have concluded a formal intergovernmental agreement, thus rising to an even higher level the broad cooperation and friendship that already exists between the Apostolic See and the government of the United States. Signing the present agreement is thus a further step, watch this, in the Holy See's long-term strategy to ensure and promote legality, transparency, and ethical behavior in the economic and financial fields. That should blow your mind away. What is the Vatican doing? Why are they the ones that are going to ensure and promote legality, transparency, and ethical behavior in economic and financial fields? That's not their realm. The church should not be involved in these issues, but this is what she wants to do. Now, it did not finish here. Watch this. It says, following Archbishop Gallagher's remarks, the United States Ambassador to the Holy See, Mr. Kenneth Hackett, made the following statement. Today's signing marks a significant step in both the United States and the Holy See, that's the Vatican's effort, to work collaboratively towards a global standard to combat offshore evasion. What did it say right there? That they are working together for a what? A global standard. What is a global standard? That means a worldwide economic financial system. What does it say in Revelation 13? They're going to control buying and selling. Not finished. It says here, a global standard to combat offshore tax evasion. In partnership with the Holy See, we are working towards building a stronger, more stable, and more accountable global financial system. I don't know about you, but that is Revelation chapter 13, verse 17, happening before our very eyes. They are admitting, both the United States and the Vatican, right? The ambassadors for both. They're saying we're working together, we're joining together, we are going to establish what? A more stable, stronger, and accountable global financial system. And the papacy themselves saying we are going to ensure and promote this happens on economic and financial fields. My loved ones, we are seeing prophecy being fulfilled before our very eyes. That should blow our minds away. That should tell us amazing how far this relationship has been coming across between our nation and the Vatican. And while there was a big gap in the beginning, right, because of the separation of church and state, because of the abuses, because of what the founding fathers understood, what we're seeing is that this huge gap that existed, which was the Atlantic Ocean, is now what? Is now coming together closer and closer and closer and closer. And these two powers are joining, my loved ones. And very soon we shall see the end of this. Now, I want to finish with the book of Daniel. Go with me, please, to Daniel chapter 3. Why Daniel chapter 3? Because in Daniel chapter 3, it talks about Babylon lifting up an image to the beast. Daniel chapter 3 talks about King Nebuchadnezzar lifting up an image, and he says, all nation, tribes, tongue, and people were to worship. At first it was a trick, right? At first it was a dedication ceremony. Then it turned into a worship ceremony. And it says, all shall worship and bow down to this image. And whoever did not would receive a death decree. That's exactly what's happening in Revelation chapter 13, right? And King Nebuchadnezzar said, but what happened is that there were 3 Hebrew boys. Now, there were approximately 60,000 Hebrews that had been taken from Jerusalem into Babylon after the destruction of the city. And it says that among the 60,000, now these were princes, these were the creme of society. And these 3 Hebrew princes, it says here, they were taken and they were there at this moment. And guess what? 60,000 Hebrews bowed down. And they bowed down and worshiped this image. But these 3 Hebrew boys, all teenagers, decided that they were not going to. And we talked about this previously. Because why? Because it transgressed God's holy law, his 10 commandments, the 2nd commandment, right? Thou shalt not bow down. Thou shalt not worship images, right? Thou shalt not prostrate yourself unto anything, because God is jealous and God does not give his worship to anything or anyone. These 3 Hebrew boys decided that they were not going to. And so what happened is, it says here, that King Nebuchadnezzar was furious, right? And he says, oh, how dare these young boys. And so it says here in verse number 10, verse 9. So they spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever, right? These young boys have not worshiped your image. These young boys, and it says in verse number 13, that was from 10 to 12, that these certain Jews, they do not want to bow down and worship. And then it says in verse number 13, we're in Daniel 3:13. Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before them. And King Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image which I have set up?" Now he says in verse 15, "If you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn," and it says all the music, "to immediately bow down and worship the image which I made. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" And so these three Hebrew boys, my loved ones, three teenagers, decided that they would prefer to die than disobey God's commandments. And it says, their response is in verse 16. "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, 'O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hands.'" And so you see that and you say, wow, that's a great manifestation of faith, right? These three Hebrew boys are saying what? No. Our God will deliver us. He has the power to deliver us. Nobody can withstand the power of our God. But at the same time, he is a sovereign God. And look at what it says in verse number 18. "But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image which you have set up." My loved ones, this is, for me, the pure manifestation of what it says in Revelation chapter 14, verse 12, when it says that in the end times, when the beast rises up again, when the images rise it up, when he receives his political power, and we're going to see in future presentations, the next one actually, that this is going to be a world imposition. It's saying that there is going to be a group of Christians, there's going to be a group of God-following people that are going to say in the end times that they're going to be pointed to by the angels and say, "You see here is the patience or the perseverance of the saints. Here are they that have the faith of Jesus Christ and that keep the commandments of God." And so this, my loved ones, Daniel chapter 3 is the example. It's the manifestation of what it means to have faith, the faith of Christ, and to keep the commandments of God. And this is the faith that we are going to need in the end times. Because what happened in Daniel chapter 3, it says in Revelation chapter 13, will repeat itself. And so seeing these things, seeing the signs, seeing what is happening, my loved ones, we then should be saying, I need the faith of Jesus Christ. I want to be faithful as Christ was. Despite all of the things that were coming, despite in Gethsemane, he almost gave up, right? He was like, "Father, pass this cup." But he said, no. Not my will be done, but your will be done, Father. And he followed and he stayed faithful to the Father. That's the same faith of those three Hebrew boys, and that's the faith that you and I need. Now, that faith does not come forth overnight. That is a faith that has been nourished, that has been cherished. In the case of these three Hebrew boys, I think that from the very beginning, their parents told them these principles because of the things that happened to take them out of Babylon were horrific. That's the faith that you and I need. A daily surrender, a daily giving over, spending that quality, intimate time with God, with Christ, with the Word, and getting to know Him and getting Him to reflect His character on us, and so that we can reflect His glory to the world. That's what it means, my loved ones, to have that intimate daily relationship. And I pray and I hope that you have that relationship. And if you don't, to start it. Make it daily priority to spend time in studying the Word so that we can be ready. Thank you very much for being with us, and God bless you.